Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to introduce today's panel on behalf of P1 Consulting, Getting Bendy with it, the pressing need for new agility in P3s. So P1 Consulting is one of Canada's most dynamic and progressive consulting firms, with a strong reputation and infrastructure in real estate. Today, P1 has participated in over 80 P3 projects, either as procurement advisor, fairness advisor, or facility management advisor. We serve international businesses and national public sector agencies, including municipalities, provincial, and federal jurisdictions. Now, P3s, given their long-term nature, have to adapt to evolving needs of the owners and the people and their assets. Technology and other innovations are not only changing how and what we build, but they're also transforming how we procure and how we write agreements. P1 has been actively engaged in writing practical P3 output specifications for over 20 years. We work with clients to consider future use and identify if and what contractual mechanisms can be included in the agreement to support flexibility over the long term. In our experience, processes based on agile principles with discrete sprints and clear opportunities for collaboration drive the most value for clients. We have seen firsthand how the conversion of shelled space at a hospital earlier than anticipated and increased use of transit can create operational maintenance challenges, and how new energy technologies can be adapted mid-contract to generate cost savings. Implementing these changes requires effective governance, mutual understanding of cost and risks, and respectful and timely communications. So our panel today will do a deep dive into collaboration and explore the need to embrace a new spirit of flexibility in project agreements while ensuring market comfort. So we will ask, how do you design P3s for agility and accelerate impact? Leading this discussion today will be our moderator, Josh Van Deurzen, partner at Torys. Josh advises clients on commercial agreements for infrastructure and P3 projects on both sides of the Canada-US border. His work spans the infrastructure ecosystem on all aspects of development and financing infrastructure projects, including healthcare, broadband, transit, transportation, water and wastewater education, and power. Joining Josh is this lovely panel: Louise Panneton, President and Managing Director of P1 Consulting; Lorri Rowlandson, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Innovation at BGIS, also channeling her inner Dorothy of Oz this morning. Tim Treharne, America's Advisor Services Leader, Arup; Sean Wiley, Executive Vice President, Asset and Contract Management Infrastructure, Ontario. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. Thank you to Louise and the team at P1 Consulting for inviting me to moderate what promises to be a very interesting discussion. Before we get started, if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions of our panelists, you can do so by using the P3 app. And with that, we'll get right into it. As the market evolves, we want to make sure that we don't throw out the good with the bad. We've seen collaborative models such as Alliance and progressive design build gaining momentum and popularity by embedding in collaboration and greater dialogue. What are characteristics the P3s offer that are not present in these models and should not be lost as we evolve the model? Louise, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you very much. And as many of you know, I'm very passionate about this topic. Integrating in the operational phase into the P3 drives a lot of value. The first thing I'd say is warranty. Really, you don't have to worry about a warranty on any of the construction or systems or equipment. It's embedded in the P3. And it drives also better design decisions at the onset because in the end, the operator is going to have the responsibility. These are things that the P3 model offers that we should retain. Other considerations really is the total cost of ownership. When you're thinking about making a decision, you're making it on the basis of not only what is it going to cost to build, but also to operate. We've seen very many examples where slight adjustments in terms of selection of upfront constructed items will deliver significant savings and significant efficiencies to the operations. So these are a couple of the areas that really are important in terms of the P3 and do drive a lot of value.
Tim, what are your thoughts on this question?
I think it was, I really enjoyed yesterday's debate. I must say that it was a very, very well done, so kudos to the teams doing that. And I think my view on the difference between P3 and alliances is that, you know, alliance is a perfectly valid model. There's nothing wrong with alliances, but it does require a lot of resource from the public sector in order to make it happen over an extended period also. So I think that's a key feature of alliances, which perhaps we don't need so much resource from the client side in relation to doing P3s. And so if you've got a big program, then probably a P3 might be a better option in that circumstance. In relation to comparison with progressive design build, I guess the big issue there is competitive tension is the thing you tend to lose because you're bringing on the contractor early in the process, whereas in progressive P3, you can bring on a developer and not necessarily have the contractor involved in the earlier stage. We've just been doing that in San Francisco with the progressive P3. We're running for the city and county there on the Potrero bus yard, and the contractor comes in later in the process. Now that doesn't always work, and it has to be the right kind of project. But that's another difference and another way P3 can provide a bit of the best of both worlds. I would also caveat that with market conditions as well, because we have a market at the moment where contractors have a lot of options, and so there's a number of things for them to consider around that.
Sean, Lorri, did you have anything you wanted to add on this one?
No, I think on overall, I think that we want to make sure that we don't lose. I think the bottom line for me, and I'm a little selfish on this one, being the maintainer in the group here, is that we want to make sure we don't lose that maintenance aspect if we're going to be making changes to the model going forward. I'm a little selfish. I want to make sure that the M stays in the model where it's appropriate, and that's something that we look at regularly at Infrastructure Ontario. We look at the best model for the project, but I'm in favor, obviously, of making sure whatever we move towards that the maintenance aspect and the long-term life cycle of the model is somehow incorporated.
And just the state of some of the infrastructures where we've got conditions like rust out actually touch exactly on what Sean's talking about. Ensuring that the investment continues over the term of the contract means, you know, a lot of buildings with a lot more integrity and the ability to sustain over time. So I think that's another attribute.
We've seen many successes and some challenges in the implementation of P3s and other partnering approaches over the past few years. Based on your experiences, what are the primary factors involved in the most successful projects that you know of? And how can these be applied to future projects, including P3s? Tim, do you want to start us on this one?
Sure. I think I'll probably focus on two areas. One would be preparation, and the other is risk allocation. I think one of the things that we try to do is to help our public sector clients, and it's interesting having been involved in these programs of a variety of different countries around the world, the different approaches people have. But we really try and start to get people to think about why they're doing the project and what the objectives are. And so I always try and insist on it's why, what, and then how. That gets a little bit blurry when you move into progressive, because the what and the how tend to get a bit reversed in that scenario. But really going through a process of thinking through, getting your main, at least from the client's internal stakeholders in the room, going through setting out what the objectives are. I worked with a client in the US. We spent, I would say, a couple of hours working through what the objectives were. We then spent 2 days trying to get everybody to agree on the force ranking of those objectives, because when you get those objectives properly force ranked and everybody's agreed, not only does that get everybody pointing in the same direction and understanding why the objectives are ranked in that way, it also signposts you towards what the procurement model should be, and also towards the risk allocation as well. So it's a discipline I would highly encourage public clients to work through, and we've had varying success. We've had certainly clients who've resisted doing that, and that does lead to difficulties later, but the ones who have followed that have been a lot more successful and had a smoother process, I would say. So that's what I would say is the sort of preparation part. And then in terms of risk allocation, I think it's important to think about risk allocation for your project. I think there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to take the precedent and then try and work from that and see if that fits into the project, rather than really starting from the project and then seeing what can be done. And ultimately, what contractors want and all the parties will want is to have a more reasonable allocation of risk in the process. And there's no point going through a sort of pre-development phase if you then end up with a contract that has a very harsh risk allocation at the end. So trying to find that, trying to get that balance right. So I think my view generally is that looking at trying to take a more surgical approach to risks and see what risks are best passed to or best retained by the public authority, perhaps those risks which could be described as low probability, high impact risks probably would be best retained in many cases.
Sean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I have a couple of points as well, and they tie, I think, actually well with Tim's points. For us, managing contracts in the concession phase, 30 years is a long time, and that's really a lot about the flexibility we're talking about here. Is that long period of managing these contracts, and two things that we found make a project successful, throughout the life of the project, from construction all the way through the life cycle phase and the concession phase. Number one is a dedicated, well-trained, committed contract management team. This is not a side of desk, I think, effort that needs to be put in place by contracting authorities, and we're one of them at Infrastructure Ontario. I think it's a testament to Bert Clark and Tony Rossi and later Aaron Corey and Michael Lindsay that they've committed to actually having a contract management team in place for the contracts that we're responsible for. But one of the things we do in Infrastructure Ontario is we train the contracting authorities for the projects that are responsible for their own. So we make sure that they're well positioned. We weren't good at that in the early days, but we're much better at that, and making sure that the contract teams are well set up. And one of the things that we do with them is when we set out to train them, and our team and the contracting authority teams in hospitals and on transit projects, is make sure that they understand the mechanics of the contract, but they pick up the phone if there's a problem. And a lot of times we find that we can solve problems without bringing the lawyers into the room, and the engineers, quite frankly. And I'm speaking as an engineer. We've had some robust discussions around the energy model. It's like we got to get the engineers out of the room, and other times we got to get the lawyers out of the room, and sometimes just try to solve these problems on our own. And we have a lot of luck with that. I think ultimately the people are committed to. If there's a long-term, consistent approach to resourcing on this, those resources have a better feel for the goals that were set out that you spoke of, Tim. And I think that really leads into my second point, and I talked to my team about what's the best project we have out there. And one that seems to be, come around time and time again is our data center project in Guelph. And that one's been around for a while, and it really comes down to two things. One, we have the team that's consistent, they're well-trained, they know the project agreement well, and they've been trained on it. But that project agreement was well-crafted. At the beginning, it goes back to your point, Tim, there was a lot of thought put into what's the purpose of this facility? And the good thing about that agreement is that they have the purpose well documented and well articulated, but the failure regime was also well thought through, and it's tied directly to the goals of the agreement. And I have to say, Louise, you'll appreciate this. From my experience when I was in the facility management side, on the outsourcing side, managing the CBC contract, as a Canadian kid, running that contract, it was pretty clear to me what would happen. And there was a big financial penalty, but what would happen if Hockey Night in Canada wasn't on Saturday night? Not only would there be a big financial penalty that really focused the mind, but I'd hear it from my friends and family as well. So I think that focus is the kind of thing we need. And back to your point, Tim, we need to sit down with our project sponsors at the very beginning and say, we have a template here, a well thought through template. Let's put it aside for a moment and let's talk about what are your goals for this project? What's the purpose of this hospital or this courthouse or this data center or this transit project? And then maybe take a bespoke approach to the failure regime, tie it directly to the goals of the project, so that when you're in the middle of it and you're running into bumps, it's pretty clear to everybody, and you focus on solutions and you're not really too focused on all the words in the contract. Like, how do we solve this problem? And let's maybe we can sort out whether there's a failure later on. And that, I think, focuses our teams.
Great, thanks, Sean. Louise?
Just maybe to comment on that, and thank you, because we developed, as you know, the data center model, and it's based on business availability, just like the CBC one is. And moving away from more tactical, nickel and diming, this room is not available, to something that's more business availability, aligns to both of what you were saying, really back to the objectives. We've done it in a couple of other projects, like library and archives, et cetera. And it changes the dialogue. The dialogue is no longer coming into work and I'm upset because now I'm going to be penalized because the room wasn't available, and more about how do we focus on actually driving value for the owner, for the client, for the occupants. And definitely we see a transformation in terms of the dialogue. And the second big piece, as you said, Sean, is the people. Train them, choose them well, and make sure that they have the right culture to really work collaboratively within the environment. We shouldn't have to add in the word collaboration in the contracts. And Tim was talking about this as we were sitting there. We shouldn't have to define collaboration with a capital C in the contracts. We should choose people who have it, who have that culture, who have that approach, and are really solution-driven. It changes the way in which we look at the contracts and the services. And Lorri, you have a lot of experience in that from your time at BGIS.
Yeah, I know this isn't my question, but from an innovation perspective and a service provider perspective, I just want to endorse two things that we heard was around the change management framework and the longevity. One of our fear of longer term agreements is relevancy. And so as a sponsor of innovation, and at a time where we have unprecedented, breathtaking change, we will never have change as slow as we do today. How do we build in a great change management framework that allows that flexibility? And have you ever heard that expression, green scorecard, red face? It means that you're measuring, you're doing all the things that get the green scorecard, but you're still not happy with the relationship. And that's a symptom of a poor change management framework. And then the other thing that Louise said is so important around a really emotionally intelligent relationship. It sounds a little bit woo-woo, but the way that you pick the people and the culture that you set to collaborate around solving the problem and not fighting the people and getting away from those hierarchical procurement relationships. And this is not a PPP thing, this is just a general good practice in any outsourcing arrangement, is setting the culture. And those really progressive models actually do cultural assessments of teams. So the hiring process includes things like Thomas profiling and Myers-Briggs and compatibility assessment and partnering sessions. So I just had to underline those two as things beyond the contract that really make the difference. And that you can have a well-written contract and a poorly written contract, and what really makes the difference is the people. And we often forgo that, and it just can't be understated.
Thanks, Lorri. How can we integrate greater collaboration and foster agility from both partners in the P3, both the private sector and the public authority? Lorri, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll start, but I'd love to hear Louise weigh on this too. You can start really early. The best thing that you could do is, even before you release an RFP, is do a vendor consultation. And they will tell you directly what they're comfortable with, what works. Think of it like free consulting. It's an amazing opportunity if you craft your questions properly. They will tell you. And sometimes if you don't consult with them, you'll ask things that will create undesirable responses, or you'll pay too much from a risk perspective, to your earlier point. So think about that pre-discussion is an incredible free consulting opportunity. And you'll get to know the vendors a little bit more, their personalities. And what's amazing is you'll find consistency from the supplier market. And then, of course, you decide what you're comfortable with. And then, of course, as you get into the RFP process, do proper vendor consultations that are facilitated by somebody like Louise. It levels the playing field and creates a very constructive discussion. So that's the pre and during, and then post, as was mentioned earlier. There's a number of contract mechanisms that you can set up to have those recurring conversations as well. Louise, you probably want to add to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think during the RFP open period, we heard it a little bit yesterday, having open bilateral discussions within a fairness framework, of course, and we can absolutely set those up so it works well. But really listening. I've been in procurements where the authority has said, I know they're telling us this, but we don't believe them. So when you're at the table, understand that folks are really trying to help with the solution. They're not trying to get you. So participating in a lot of collaboration, a lot of discussion, and listening, so that as you you can embed these in your overall solutions as you move forward. So again, collaboration doesn't need to be defined. It's a way of doing things, and it's a way of approaching the project.
And if I may, Josh, I would just add that those collaboration sessions, teaming sessions you spoke about, Lorri, those kinds of things, they can be underestimated. I think that whether we write it into the PA or not, we really need, as an industry, to commit to doing them every few years, to getting people in the room together. I think as Louise was saying earlier just today, post-COVID, we've really gotten used to using video, which is good, it's very productive, but to getting the parties in the room and having a teaming session so valuable. I've done them before. And to borrow a line from Jean-Michel Rive, I don't know if he's here at this conference, but in one of these teaming sessions, we introduced ourselves, and he said, and he mentioned that he's a big believer in these sessions because he's in the maintenance business, and those sessions are about maintaining the relationship, and I think we need to commit to doing those in this industry.
And I think
we're doing a partnering session tomorrow on a contract that's 10 years old. So these are not things you do once at the beginning. You just continually, and we've been doing it in the outsourcing sector for years. Every 2-3 years you get together, put everything on the table, you become people again, and then you move forward with the relationship.
And I was just going to add, I think talking about collaboration, you should only really talk about collaboration if you really mean it, because I think that's a thing. And also, I think different people have different interpretations. So I think everybody understanding what they meant by collaboration is probably the other thing.
So I work with engineers and we're super practical, so I have to just, one way to manifest that is through a functional organization chart. So if you have people that are two in a box, one on the service provider side, one on the client side, and you solve together, you win together, you fail together, you're measured together, outside of the partnering sessions, which I still recommend on a day-to-day perspective, it's an incredibly functional way to build inherent emotional intelligence into the working relationship. So you're not trying to get each other.
Right.
Yeah.
You realize you either succeed together or fail together in the outcome of the contract. We're not succeeding if we're fighting. Right. So if we rally around the problem together, we can solve it. The problem is the problem, not each other. But that two-in-a-box approach has been one of the most effective social instruments that we've set up in contracting.
Thanks, Lorri. Sean, P3s are very long-term. How do we build in greater flexibility so that new needs, including technology, can be integrated over the long term of the project?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's really, the topic probably of this panel is really about building in flexibility, having flexibility in the long term. 30 years is a long time. I thought when I was in the FM outsourcing that these 8-10-year contracts were a long time, but 30 years, once I realized these are, and they're fixed price too, so they can become pretty rigid. I think that borrowing from some of the discussion yesterday, and you touched on this already, Tim, about risk allocation, I think one of the things we need to do is think about what we don't want to build into these contracts. I think for us, and I'll speak again a little selfishly here, is that we need to rationalize the scope of what we put in into the risk transfer discussion. I think it's not just about who's best to manage the risk. It's about, can we actually predict the life cycle of some of the stuff? And again, I'm speaking of the life cycle stage here, but can we actually predict, the life of some of the electronic equipment, the digital equipment, the distributed antenna systems, the security systems? Technology is changing so fast. We all get a new phone every 2 years. And it's really hard, I think, for our bidders to sort of, pin down the life cycle of some of the components. So I am obviously in favor of scaling some of that back because I'm in the bricks and mortar business. I'm about keeping the lights on in my buildings. I'm also the guy that's faced with a massive deferred maintenance budget on my traditional portfolio. So I love the DBFM model. I think we can still achieve a lot by not life cycling everything, but building it into the design and construction phase and maintenance, that collaboration. We can still get that on a security system, just maybe not life cycle it 2 and 3 times over the 30-year period. So we can get the benefits of it. The DBF model is very good for that. And I think that if we could open that up a bit, that will add some more flexibility for later years. The second thing I would add is, and I think it's really, whenever we talk about flexibility at this conference and on this panel here, it's all going to flow through the variation schedule. And I got a couple things to say about the variation schedule. For the contracts that we have in place already, we've got to work with it, and we've got to get better at using it. We're just starting, I think, at Infrastructure Ontario, and with our partners on the service provider side, at looking at how we can make better use of the variation schedule. I oversee 1,000 projects a year on my traditional portfolio. Hundreds of those are in leased locations. And landlords can be a real pain in the neck to deal with, and in leases, we have to navigate those. But there's never any drama. They rarely come to my desk. But when we have a variation for some reason, people get a little tense. To me, it should just be another project. We should be able to manage it like a project and focus on the project and not focus on the fact that we're actually changing the agreement and we're making a variation. I wouldn't suggest we change the words, but maybe I think let's just focus on doing a project. And I think that leads into my second point on that one is that, there's a really good discussion and the debate yesterday, and you mentioned it, Tim, and I think some of what I heard yesterday, I think we can adopt maybe in a new variation schedule going forward. So back to your question, Josh, is how do we build some of this into future agreements? Let's take a look at the variation schedule in the concession phase, which is really where we're looking for flexibility. Let's take a look at making a little more open. I think that good discussion and good debate yesterday around the progressive and alliance model, and maybe at the risk of being tagged a communist here, there's some language that we can borrow from the alliance model and from the progressive model and bring that forward into a separate variation schedule for the concession phase, because really that's where the flexibility we're looking for will come from.
Lorri?
I completely agree with Sean. I don't think I have anything else to add to that, actually.
Maybe
there's a question. Oh,
one
sorry,
thing
go
to
ahead,
add would be, I love the idea of having a different variation schedule that deals with the operations phase. I think, we've copied and pasted and said, oh, it's going to work in both. It doesn't. It really doesn't. You're having that flexibility. The other thing you mentioned, Sean, that I think is really interesting is the idea of potentially having some elements that are embedded in the design and construction, because there's a lot of value in them being in high technology, et cetera, but perhaps having a different operational model. Maybe it's not a fixed price. Maybe for that piece of it, the life cycle is not embedded in the base deal so that we can have it performed by Project Co, but not that they have to guess what it's going to be over the next 30 years when it's actually impossible to predict. So as we look at models for the future, embedding that type of discussion in, I think, is beneficial on the authority side. Find that right balance of risk, that right balance of delivery.
Mm-hmm. There's a question on the screen that relates to this point, so maybe we can hit it now. I think we've kind of answered it in part, but making significant changes to operating P3s is very difficult. How do we get this done if our contracts don't contemplate the change in advance? Louise, Sean, do you want to?
Yeah, it is difficult, and I think that we get a little intimidated by the fact that it's a variation, and the tentacles go out into a lot of aspects of our buildings. If you want to change, you want to change this room, and you want to change an operating room into a different use, it impacts the HVAC system and the power system and the fire alarm system, and that makes people anxious, and we worry about the downstream and the unintended consequences and all of these legal terms that we worry about. But I think that my suggestion is that let's just look at the problem. Let's just maybe put the contract aside and just get the designers in the room and talk about the intent and talk about it as a project. and what do we want to achieve here? And then after we figure that out, what's the best model to implement it? How do we construct it? How do we design it? How do we maintain it? And then after we've talked that through, then look at the contract and figure out how it would match with the contract. So my answer would be, let's work the problem, I think, Josh, because yes, we have to acknowledge that it's challenging. These are 30-year contracts, and there's a lot at stake, and it's fair, I think, that the private sector makes their profit, and I think that's something we have to acknowledge on the contracting authority side. But let's work the problem. I think that would be my suggestion, and then look at how it would apply to a variation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that getting the concept of some kind of operational variation that, as you said, is not a contract variation would be the thing. If we can just at least get that notion in there so that there's a way to bring people together to try and think about it.
I think we bring it to that point, and then what helps even further is getting third-party validation, just so we're getting proper value for money. And this is where we are in a very difficult time, because change is going to continue to happen, and we need to make sure we're continuing to evolve. And nothing's going to stay the same for 5 years. That's the problem with the pace of innovation. So going through proper paces internally, as Sean suggested, but getting a third party just to sign off on the value for money as an independent testimonial.
One of the biggest complaints I hear about the variation procedure or the change procedure is it takes forever. Like, it literally takes forever. And so when you're impacting the business, that is a bad thing. It's a really bad thing. You started off by focusing in on the outputs and how you drive better value for the business. So, for everyone in the room, like, let's find easier, better ways that are more nimble, more agile to move these forward, and maybe not think about them all as one size fits all. It has to fit in this model that we're pushing it through. Back to the operations phase, perhaps there's 2 or 3 types of variations that will allow us to expedite them and get things done. It is a frustration for the authorities not to be able to get what they want done in their building within a reasonable time frame. And so that's something we could focus in on, in which case making changes would not be as difficult. It would be more collaborative.
There was an interesting panel yesterday on AI. Louise, how do you see AI changing project delivery and facilities management industries, and how can we future-proof the P3 approach to make sure that this type of innovation can be accommodated?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. I sat through that panel with some colleagues, and at first I was going, I don't know if I like this. Like, this AI thing, I'm not sure if I like it. But as I was listening and as I was understanding how the automation can actually drive efficiency, so instead of spending all of the time on things that are more menial, folks can build on the relationship, can actually look and try to drive greater value. That's where I think AI can really help. It's now embedded in most of the building systems, and understanding how that as well can help us, even in the payment mechanisms. We don't need to have someone to call us to say the lights are out. Our systems do it now. So, I think that's where I see a lot of value coming into play.
I think there's a lot of innovation theater happening around AI and a lot of buzz, but at the end of the day, it's just another tool that helps us accelerate progress. So as long as your contracts have strong change and innovation processes, just think of AI as another extension of that. The one caution I would say is don't think about it ethereally, because it's a very overwhelming topic. Think about what you want to solve and use the tool to accelerate and solve the problem. So instead of spinning in the theory zone, think about use cases and start from there and then work forward. But it's really easy to get caught up in the theoretical and the buzz and all the negative. Just think of it as a tool and an instrument of progress, but it's no different than any other innovation tool.
It's a really good point. If I may add, Josh, on this one, on a lighter note, at Infrastructure Ontario, every year we do a fundraising exercise. At Halloween, we have a pumpkin carving contest. And it amazes me the participation we get. There were 20 entrants this year in the contest, and people are very creative. And one of the finalists, I was chatting with the team from our project controls group, and they had a very innovative pumpkin design. And I chatted with them and I asked them, how did you come up with this idea? And they said, well, we took the idea of carving a pumpkin, and we documented that, and we took the idea of a pumpkin carving contest, we documented that, and then we took all the boring concepts around project controls and we fed it into ChatGPT, and we asked it for some ideas for design of a pumpkin carving. And they used that, and they were one of our finalists. And I thought that was so creative. And just back to your point about using it as a tool to maybe just kind of take your thinking to the next level. So I would say to anybody out there that's interacting with the Infrastructure Ontario Project Controls Group, be on your toes, because they're a pretty innovative group, and they're just getting started.
Well, one of the things they were talking about yesterday to collaborate what you're saying is the use of AI is a starting point. It'll get you to the 60-70%. You build on that. That's where the value of AI is. It's not just accepting it blindly. In fact, they even were saying often it's not right. So you need to have that intelligence, that human side of it to come in and leverage it, validate it, and make sure that it's doing what you really want it to do from an outcome perspective.
With respect to existing P3 projects, what can we do to benefit from collaboration, innovation, and new practices in order to drive value and move away from adversarial relationships? John, do you want to start us?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Josh. We talked about teaming sessions, and I'm sure Lorri will have some more to add on this one. At IO, we've done a few things. I've spoken about the team we have in place, and we've done a few things to drive collaboration and drive, the kind of thinking that we're looking for in terms of managing these contracts. But firstly, I think that we developed a training tool set. We recognize, a few years back that we needed to develop consistency not only across, our organization, but when we're handing a project over to a hospital, that they're well positioned to manage the contract on their own. And there's a couple elements of that training. One is just the mechanics of it. Just making your monthly payments, sitting in the performance management meeting, walking through that, evaluating, the payment itself and going through that. And by the time you do that whole process, the next one's on your lap, and that doesn't end for 30 years. And it's a very continuous process. So we get them ready for that, teach them the mechanics. And I think the second part is, really, remind them about the goals of the project. That information is in those documents, the goals and the intent of the project. And I think we found that tool set has provided the consistency across the industry that's allowed people to have conversations outside of just maybe talking about the dispute and digging their heels in. It's allowed people to really break away from focusing on maybe the little deductions and focus on some of the bigger picture things that we're talking about on the stage here about flexibility. I think, listening to this group here today and yesterday, and I was chatting with my team about this, we called our training tool set P3 101, but I think we're ready for 201 or 301 to really, bring it to the next level. The other thing we do across the province is we have a monthly meeting with all of the contract authorities with our internal team, but each one of the hospitals and members of the Ministry of Transportation sit in a monthly meeting with us. They're allowed to bring agenda topics forward. It's an open forum. We found it to be really beneficial. It allows people to sheepishly say, we're not sure this is working right. What do you think? And that happens in the monthly meeting. But what we found is that there's a distribution list for those meetings, and people will use that as an open forum just to ask questions across the industry. And over the last few years, through contacts in this forum here at the conference, our team has made contact with contracting authorities across Canada, and they're actually starting to join in these calls as well. So I think that that level of collaboration has opened up discussion across the country and allowed people to share ideas. And I'm really encouraged when I see some of the dialogue, because I see the emails that go back and forth, to see how people are asking questions, and the tone is much different now than it was a few years ago, where it was, here's how you can win that discussion. Now it's about here's how you can manage and facilitate a solution. So the tone has really changed. The last thing I would add here, and this is maybe a little bit more around the innovation side of the question, Josh, is, and it ties back into the use of data, not quite with artificial intelligence, but I think that we have a lot of data. It's really cool on these contracts. I'm envious, quite frankly, of the data I have at my fingertips on these P3 contracts that come in through the performance management reports we get every month. And being at this conference a few years back, I was out there in the audience, and there's a lot of talk, and as there was even yesterday, I heard a lot of talk about on time and on budget, which is absolutely paramount for the P3 industry, and it's a source of pride. But sitting out there in the audience, I was thinking to myself, what about well-maintained? And we talk a little bit about it, and Louise is really good about getting us up here on the panels, and we get to talk about the asset management phase and maintaining these contracts. So one of the things we did, we get questions from our executives about how do we know that we're getting value for money, that these are well maintained? Well, we did a few years ago, and Renee Massaud is out in the audience. He works in my organization. He's very bright with data. We came up with what we call a maintenance service indicator. And we took all of our KPIs and our customer service data and our facility condition index, all of that data together, and we came up with one number. And it's quite creative, and it allows our executive to see, we got on time, we got on budget, and now we've got a well-maintained number. And this indicator, I think it's something that we'll roll out to the industry for feedback. We developed it ourselves. It's a bit of an algorithm. We debated the weighting of all the elements on there, and that's open for debate by the industry. But I think that it's an innovative approach that we've taken that gives us, that one indicator on a scale of 1 to 100 on how it's doing. All of our projects are in the 90s. I think what we want to do is maybe roll that out to some hospitals and some transit projects, and I think that kind of innovation, level sets across the industry and allows us to sit back and go, these projects are actually doing quite well. And yes, we're here to talk a little bit about how can we get more flexibility, but I think that can let us breathe a little bit and know that these projects, these DBFMs, are doing very well. The taxpayers are getting value for money, and we should be proud of that, and gives us a little breathing room to talk about how we can be flexible on some of the other things we talked about here.
And I think it certainly is about the behaviors, what happens in the long term. How do you get those behaviors to work? And certainly over the years I've seen some situations where there's been great collaboration. There was nothing about collaboration in the contract, but there's been great collaboration between the parties about solving problems and working through to solutions that work for all the parties. And then there are other situations with even relatively simple contracts where you have a very overzealous contract manager who's trying to really impose strict terms. So I think getting that sort of collaboration, I think, is really important. I think also the role of the long-term developer investor is also important, because I think developing relationships over the long term, I think if you've got a stable counterparty, that also helps in the development of the relationships, which then, when problems arise, and there are certainly things that the long-term investor developers can do around projects, relationship with communities, and so on, around projects, which can really help some of that part, which really helps the relationship overall. But really, it does come down to those relationships and collaboration with a small c.
Another thing I'd add is courage. Courage from the authority to actually do the right thing. There's no such thing as a perfect building. It does not exist. Even the data center is 99.999. It's not a perfect building. Things are going to happen. And, often there's fear on the public sector side that someone's going to come in and audit them, and someone's going to come in and trap them because they didn't apply a deduction and they didn't do, specifically what was in the contract. In the end, doing the right thing is actually what drives the best value. That is the thing that drives the value. So, back to, can we change something in the contract? I'm not sure, but we should look. But part of it is applying some reasonableness as you're looking at deductions, as you're looking at the manner in which the contract's being applied, and having the courage to say in some instances, this actually doesn't make any sense. You've done everything you possibly could to make this right, and it still was wrong. So, there is that courage on the public sector side, on the authority side, that is really, really important, and it's one of the traits of people who collaborate well, having the courage to do the right thing. So in part, I think we need to look at, how do we audit? How do we review? When the AG comes in and says, let's have a look at your books, well, let's make it a success that in some instances, you know what? We applied reasonableness in the manner in which we manage the contract.
I think one of the best practices we've seen in the contracts we've been exposed to is the ones Louise has done where she has guiding principles at the front. And that is the litmus or the talisman that we always go back to. So there might be some of the mechanics that are outlined to Louise's point, but let's go back to our guiding principles. And if that's in the contract, then you do have a rallying point, which I think is an excellent point. But it sounds, again, a bit superfluous, but it's really a great instrument to reground the team and rally around. And then I just have to go back. I agree with everything Sean says all the time, but I have to underline something Sean said that was so fundamental, is training. It was the first thing that you said, and it's something that we struggle with when there's a lot of turnover. I'm speaking from a service provider's perspective, and you're always dealing with somebody who's learning or training, and we see this in high turnover environments. Hospitals are one category, for example. And you just never quite hit your stride. And the opportunity lost with longer term contracts is that synergy. You really get the maximum synergy, total cost of ownership, if you can really have a longer term productive relationship. But when you're constantly in startup mode or in beginning mode, square one, you lose that productivity. And it sounds so foundational, but it is the foundation of everything else that is built upon it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that we have to be honest with ourselves that there's going to be turnover, and we do need to retrain people. But factor in the fact that these contracts are very complex. They're very complicated. They're more complicated than traditional FM outsourcing. They're more complicated than leases. It's still an emerging practice in the industry. So we need to factor that in, so the training comes in, but I'll tie it back to what you just said, Louise. You're right, sometimes we have to have the courage on the contracting authority side, but it goes both ways to say that, we need to be reasonable when it comes to assessing penalties or settling disputes. We can't just go by the contract. They're 30-year agreements, so you do get a little anxious. I think that you're going to be audited, or somebody's going to say, "Why did you do that?" We can get around that. We can document it, but have reasonable outcomes that we've done. I think on FM outsourcing, and we can emulate some of that. I think that we have done some of that at IO. We've had sometimes due to the quirkiness of the way that. Room weightings are set out in terms of the failure regime. You come up with some pretty crazy numbers for what is really a minor failure, and you've got to be reasonable in those scenarios. But I think we need to take that same kind of thinking to the way we operate these, because again, they're 30-year deals, and you're in this together for a long time. And look, I'm going to say this, is I was in the session yesterday with Phil Verster, and I can't remember the exact context, but he talked about three most important things in their projects are customer service, and customer service. And I think that we need to constantly remind ourselves that as we look through these agreements, and we're all about maybe winning or making sure that we get this right as per the agreement, we got to remind ourselves that this is a hospital. It's there to serve patients, or it's a courthouse that's there to help our justice sector. We got to remind ourselves the purpose of the building, or the project itself. Focus on that. Focus on the customers in the building, and back to the guiding principles, and say, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve here, and not get too dogmatic about the words in the contract and how we settle some of our issues, and strive for flexibility.
Well, interestingly, both Lorri and I have been on the IFMA board, International Facilities Management Board, and the one characteristic I can say about facility managers is they really care about their buildings. They really care. The technicians really care. It's a sense of pride. It's a sense of ownership, et cetera. So, part of that, as you're talking about, Sean, it's really recognizing that collaboration, that team spirit is embedded in the role that they play. So if they come in the morning, and every morning someone says, your building's screwed up, you screwed up, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Ultimately, they lose that passion for the building. So I think embedding back in those practices is important too, and that's every day. That's every day you have to do it.
Maybe we'll move into the questions. We have a few minutes left. First question is, how can we abolish the practice of over-reliance and plug-and-play of previous precedent PAs? Tim and Sean, you both touched on this previously about the importance of sort of tailoring the risk allocation and the PAs to reflect project risks. You want to maybe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's certainly a particular hobby horse of mine. I think there is a danger with some of the plug and play approach to these things, that you end up using a contract. You have concepts in a contract from 3 or 4 transactions ago, and nobody even knows why they were in the contract in the first place because it was done by somebody some years ago. So I think the best practice, as far as I'm concerned, would be for every transaction you come up with a term sheet of what you want to do, what you want to have in your project agreement, and then you see what you can reuse from previous agreements, rather than starting from a precedent and just copy pasting. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, elevators are important. We have a vertical detention center. We've got a beautiful new courthouse right across the street. Hospitals, everybody needs elevators. We've got a regime around elevator failures, but I think we have to be realistic about that. We don't have it in our other facilities. We don't have the strict penalties that we have. I'm not saying we should get rid of that element, but I think we have to be practical about it. So to answer the question is how do we abolish the practice? Well, I guess abolish is a strong word, but we need to sit down at the beginning and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? Yes, elevators are important. We need to move patients up and down here. Yeah. But what's the best way to do that? Piling huge penalties, trust me, they don't get to drop down anyway, so you're not really going to achieve what you want here. Let's look, maybe there's another way to get elevator reliability, or some combination or hybrid.
I do think that the Canadian market is very successful because we've got existing models. So, I think it's a combination of, there's probably 60% of the PA that really can move from project to project. It's that 40% we should be focusing in, like Tim mentioned. That's where we should be having our term sheets, our discussions, our et cetera. But the things that should be template should stay template, not throwing that out as well with, looking at this in a different way. So just.
Well, thanks to all for a great discussion. Thank you to P1 Consulting for supporting this important conversation. Please put your hands together and help me thank our panelists.